Welcome to the Council of the Cancelled.
And somehow whenever I hear that somebody's a grifter or a charlatan, I now have a positive sense of, oh, what did they say?
You know, I wrote this thinking, okay, I'm not really representing the majority opinion, but a really respectable minority opinion.
They weren't disgraced until you called them disgraced, and then everybody looked around and said, oh, they're disgraced? They're probably disgraced.
We're sitting here looking metacognitively at our own minds, doubting ourselves, and the power to convene these things. We're sharing the same story.
I have a feeling Schoolhouse Rock might be canceled after this.
Yeah, that's right. We'll just update the episode.
I'm Nicole Shanahan, and welcome to the Council of the Cancelled, where free speech prevails. Today, we bring together a group of prominent experts who share one thing in common. Their work has been censored and their integrity questioned, all because their findings challenge the status quo. Together, we can shed new light on their perspectives and learn from their insights, no matter how inconvenient they may be to those who wish to silence their voices.
Welcome to the Council of the Cancelled, an idea that has been born from several of these conversations and realizing that there's very much a trend at hand and that there's enough of us that maybe it's time for us to have these conversations in larger groups than one-on-one, where we just are being interviewed, telling our story from our own personal standpoint. I think we now realize there's a wider issue, not just nationally, but globally. And many, many expert voices have been silenced. Many parents have been silenced. There's a whole mechanism that we're realizing is at play to silence opinions that are dissenting against the status quo. And these are very serious things. But I want us to set a vibe for this. And I think the vibe should be light and joyous and productive. Because we've been in the middle of it in our own lives for quite a while. And there's some joy now in sitting together in a group and actually talking about what we're going to do next. So here I am in our first council with Bhattacharya, Eric Weinstein, Mike Benz. Many of you know them, follow them. They have been incredibly inspirational. They have been up against the odds. They have been deplatformed and thankfully replatformed thanks to X. And so today we're going to share live a conversation where we are going to unify some of the common threads that we have been talking about. This is being described right now as a decentralized, multinodal reseating of representative experts. So here we go, guys. I mean, how are you feeling right now? How many times have you been told you're anti-science today?
I mean, what I want, Nicole, is that there should never have to ever be another Council of the Cancelled. We can have society run in a way so that our institutions welcome the kinds of dissident voices that have been shunned aside during the pandemic and else.
It is also kind of funny that I don't remember people using the word grifter and charlatan outside of like an 1880s vibe. That, you know, those were fighting words, or you'd fight a duel. And somehow whenever I hear that somebody's a grifter or a charlatan, I now have a positive sense of, oh, what did they say? What's their perspective? Have they written anything I can read? And I don't think that was the initial intent of these campaigns against such people, but it is backfiring in kind of a humorous way.
Right,
Yeah.
It's the same thing with science. I mean, when someone's called anti-science, I think, oh, they must know their stuff. What can I learn from this anti-science person? Because if the science establishment is against them, then they clearly have ideas or research that are not being allowed in for a reason. And this gets to something I think we were talking about before, which is about the self-destruction of trust in institutions that do the gatekeeping of ideas that provide, sort of the consensus building architecture that ends up being implemented in policy or being implemented in public health or censorship decisions or government decisions. And the fact that we're all talking about these labels as being badges of honor, that they must be right because the institutions are opposed to them, I think gets to this question about what is the role of these institutions in our country how they developed, how they lost that trust, what can be done now. And we hear this term democracy a lot, and they always say these terms together, democratic institutions. And we were talking before that I see there being two parallel tracks with the role of institutions in censorship and cancellation, which is you have the social media side, which is people being gated out of Instagram or Facebook or YouTube. Then there's the institutional side, which is people not being allowed to publish in the National Academy of Sciences or in magazine or in in journals or in government agencies. And so those two things I think intersect with each other, and they're each their own sort of problem for reseating institutions to represent the people rather than a cloistered set of interests.
The way that I think we can start with this conversation, and you said, let's just have one council and then hopefully we don't have to have it again. In our brainstorm for this live session, we already started talking about how deep and how powerful these mechanisms are. And I just want to propose that I think we must continue these councils. There'll be different people, different voices, different backgrounds, different opinions that we will be convening until there is a proper reseating of experts. And so I want to lay that groundwork that we're trying something right now in this format that is, my hope being, is something that lasts in many different iterations. We're open sourcing this format if others want to engage in it. But the ideal is that we either invite the institutions to reform themselves in the way that they ought to be reformed, or we will be restarting our own institutions. And our institutions will be based on principles on how we reach expert consensus, an infrastructure for reaching expert consensus. So, Eric, I want to turn this one over to you. We had talked about what this infrastructure should look like, how it has looked in previous formats, and the risk of what happens if we don't.
Sure. I mean, one of the things that I think I was most moved by was your concern that by creating consensus in this new way of taking the dissenting portion of the expert community and deciding that they suffer from some strange psychological malady or incompetence, or that they're bizarrely self-serving, the institutions have been running their own credibility into the ground. And you can see this across different disciplines and different fields through the polling data. How much confidence do you have in medicine, in journalism, et cetera? Even science, in particular with disastrous public health under COVID. I think that what you're trying to do is you're trying to say, each time you buy a consensus by doing character assassination against dissenters, you're actually destroying the long-term respect in that institution. How many people still feel the same way about UPenn, Harvard, and MIT, my three universities, after those disastrous testimonies before Congress? So what you're seeing, I think, is, I think this is your plan. Your plan seems to be to offer the institutions a way back by saying, here's how we would come up with a protocol for figuring out who are the stakeholders and the representatives of the public in the expert community that are being silenced or being maligned or pre-bunked or whatever crazy terminology we'll get.
Yeah, we'll talk about cognitive vaccines in a minute.
Right. So
that's wild.
In essence, what I see, and this is your suggestion, maybe you're too modest to sort of make it, is let's try to use the campaign to push the experts back into the institutions from which they were ejected. We know who these people are, and they're quite good. They were trained in our institutions. And if that fails, then we have a plan B, which is that you grow the camp. So either kill it or grow it, and you kill it by reseating the experts inside of the institutions. And if you can't kill it, you grow it, and you make sure that you have an alternate plan B.
The thing that I'm realizing is that it's actually already quite big, but it's fragmented and not united, and that we're still in the storytelling, information collection phase. And what I was really inspired by, Jay, you said 30,000 qualified doctors and epidemiologists and public policy experts signed your Great Barrington Declaration. I did not realize it was that many people.
Yeah, I mean, almost 1 million regular people signed it, but many of the regular people are tremendously impressive. But with the particular expertise in epidemiology, medicine, I think like something like 30,000 people signed it. What that tells me, Nicole, is that the center, which basically labeled the Great Barrington Declaration as a fringe idea, was not actually a fringe idea.
Exactly.
And in fact, I have to tell you, I myself was fooled about this point when I wrote it. Right?
I think if you tell all the individuals
Wait,
that they're individually fringe, that they don't find each other.
Yeah, exactly. And so like I wrote this thinking, okay, I'm not really representing the majority opinion, but a really respectable minority opinion back at the time. Mm-hmm. And now when I look back, I'm not so sure that that's true.
Well, they're projecting. I mean, I really feel like in general, when somebody says fringe or charlatan or grifter or guru or ne'er-do-well or whatever, what they're really doing is that they're telling you about the weakness of their position and trying to make sure that they strike first. To be honest, can we all admit that there's a little part of our brain that sits around saying, gosh, so many bots said this terrible thing about me, maybe it's true. And it's weird because we know that this is a psychological defect, that our brains weren't trained for an era in which you could buy 10,000 accounts that all scream the same thing. And yet, we're sitting here looking metacognitively at our own minds, doubting ourselves, and the power to convene these things. We're sharing the same story. They got you too, they got me on this, and here's how they use that language. It's only by creating an aggregate set of information that we learn what the techniques are.
Nicole, can I pick up on one thing you said? I think it's super important. The experts that we're talking about, what we're talking about is making sure that the people are represented in these institutions. These dissenting voices often represent regular people, that are hurt by the majority decisions. And so reseating these institutions with experts, really what it means is it's putting the representatives of the people in the halls of power when the discussions are being made. I mean, that's partly my thinking with the Great Barrington Declaration. All these people were being hurt by these lockdowns, by these school closures at scale. And their voices were nowhere near the centers of power. They deserved to be. Mm-hmm. And to me, I was a representation of that group rather than just myself. That's why I was, I despite thinking, okay, maybe I'm a minority, I thought, no, there's these people, regular people have a right to be heard when these decisions are made. And so that's why I was still quite proud of it.
Well, this labeling has a self-fulfilling prophecy aspect about it. There's a technique in markets where if a hedge fund wants to, short a stock, they'll work with PR companies to create bad press about it, which will drive down the stock price, and then everyone will see the volume moving into shorts, and so other people will start to, think the company is bad, or they will start to short it themselves because everybody else is shorting it, and so it becomes a short-worthy company because everyone's shorting it. And I think there's the same thing with terms like fringe, or even the nature of cancellation itself, is people who are not yet deemed fringe or are not yet canceled by the public record saying that they are canceled, that they are fringe. They sort of become fringe because they were called fringe, not because they were at the start of it. And frankly, I think that's part of the framing of saying that someone is a disgraced scientist or something. And it's like, they weren't disgraced until you called them disgraced, and then everybody looked around and said, oh, they're disgraced? They're probably disgraced. And then, by virtue of that, now you're disgraced. And so I think, though, there is this collective immune system response that's starting to happen when those labels are thrown around, because they've abused that so much, and every time they do, they lose institutional trust because some new disaffected group says, well, that's not really true in this case. And then they look around and they say, actually, I don't trust the National Science Foundation anymore. I don't trust the National Academy of Sciences. I don't trust Tony Fauci. And this idea on expertise, I mean, I think is embodied almost in this sort of Great Barrington Declaration versus Tony Fauci type thing, where Fauci publicly declared that he was the science. That it was not a collection of experts. It was not people represented from all these different beliefs. It was all the energies were just poured, from this one Sun Ra god who's come down to us in Egypt and is saying, I am the science, and any scientist around me who opposes this is anti-science. And that works to pull off an emergency operation, to ram through something in the short term, but almost like cancer, the tumor cells spread from there in the institutions, and people it rules through fear and resentment, but that resentment builds and it starts to crack institutions. And I think we have an exciting moment in history now where the opportunity to change that course is here.
You know, there's this thing with an adjective, a profession, and then a proper name. So like fringe epidemiologist J. Bhattacharya. You had controversial Professor Jordan Peterson. And when I figured out that this was a formula because everyone who reads the New York Times knows the formula, I then did a search on controversial Professor Paul Krugman. There was not a single hit on all of Google because even though he was a professor and he had been controversial, that formula is never applied to people who aren't in the crosshairs of the thing. So we are dealing with this much more developed architecture to take out dissidents.
Yeah.
And Nicole, you do have the coolest one, dangerous woman, Nicole Shanahan.
Well, so I have a few new tags, and they didn't start showing up until after I announced I was leaving the Democratic Party, ironically. But
Uncorrelated.
there's now these databases in which your name will be associated with all of these tags, and those tags will be fringe, conspiracy theorist, dangerous, Daily Beast. Yeah, pseudoscience, very common one. Grifter, we had talked about that one, but I don't think that that's like an official Google tag yet. But you know, I've seen articles in which I'm in that have these tags under them, and I'm like, oh, this is a database. This is preempted. This is not something extracted from a general algorithm. Somebody has my name on a list, and that name is being associated with these tags, and those tags are going out with these major mainstream news articles. And I had never seen this before, and I was like, this is such an odd way of running an open internet. But it's the reality we live in. And you had described it as a digital scarlet letter in which you're walking around the real world, but everyone's looking at you, and they not only, it's not a visual tag, it's something deeper, it's a cognitive tag. And so let's get into that, because Mike, you had shared with the group before we went live this idea of not just reactively labeling individuals, but you can now preemptively do so through cognitive vaccines.
Yes. So this is this whole mad science. There's a whole field of the science of censorship, and it's totally rejuvenated the social sciences. You know, the social sciences have always had a little bit of an envy, I think, of the hard sciences, in the sense that, you know, physics can be very accountable, and chemistry, a lot of people associate that with real science, and that there are sort of real social scientists, but a lot of it is, you know, just so stories, or it's not really as hard and accountable. And that has started to change as in the post-2016 environment, when misinformation and disinformation became really sort of a government public policy initiative. It started to infuse all the universities and academics and researchers with hundreds of millions of dollars of grant funds that come from everywhere. They'll come from the National Science Foundation. They'll come from the Department of Defense or DARPA. They'll come from the State Department. They'll come from even USAID grants and Department of Homeland Security grants, and this is nominally about stopping the spread of misinformation online, which is sort of gets to the direct censorship side. But then there is a secondary field of research around the psychology of belief in wrong thoughts, which is if there is a government policy around public health, for example, vaccines might have adverse side effects. And the Department of Health and Homeland Security will now fund, together with the National Science Foundation, will fund tens of millions of dollars to a coterie of universities who specialize in psychology, sociology. They'll work with data scientists to sort of do the AI side of this.
Linguistics.
Linguistics, computational linguistics is a big part of this. And the design is that so that if you can't censor everything, you can collectively inoculate people from believing opinions the government doesn't want you to believe. This is not all that, I sometimes jokingly refer to it as digital MK Ultra, because it's sort of like this psychological control program, but it's laundered with government dollars into universities. In the case we were talking about, it was the University of Cambridge, their social decision-making laboratory, which is the study of how humans make decisions. Now, they're funded by Google Jigsaw, which has its own sort of dark history, but they have direct partnerships. This is a British psychology lab that's partnered with the Department of Homeland Security here in the US, CISA, the notorious agency that was putting out videos telling children to report their own parents and family for disinformation if they questioned COVID orthodoxies. Our Department of Homeland Security CISA office, and also with our State Department's Global Engagement Center, which was busted during the Twitter files for mass censorship and mass flagging of thousands of accounts. But they are laundering in the same way that during the Russiagate affair, you had US intelligence laundering things out to Christopher Steele and the MI6 networks out there. You have the State Department and the Department of Homeland Security laundering out to a British lab whose ultimate goal is to create a psychological vaccine against fake news.
Do they use those words?
They use those words. They have glitzy 10-minute promo videos. They have. You can go on their website and you can see the hundreds of studies they've done. They just put out one. They call it the misinformation susceptibility test, which in 2 minutes you can deduce how prone an individual is psychologically to believing false headlines. And it's the most ridiculous, politically rigged. It would be a great joke if it would be a comedy movie if it wasn't a horror, a slasher horror to our democracy. But then they launder this as a scientific finding, saying certain groups of people are more prone to believe false headlines. Well, that means the government now needs to swarm around them with a Truman Show of different grant programs to influence the news they believe. They can then use this to put pressure on the tech companies to say these are more psychologically vulnerable groups, and so we need to put harder trust and safety filters on them. This is the sort of thing that we used to call intelligence work. When we're trying to go into a region and psychologically prime people to believe news narratives coming out of the Voice of America or Radio Free Europe, we would pump money into the university system. We'd get researchers to sort of validate something scientifically. That would be picked up by CIA proprietary media like Voice of America. And then that would create this surround sound ecosystem within the country, and people would believe that, and it would redound to US interests. But now it's our own government doing it to ourselves, and that's also preventing experts from even publishing in the field, because the moment you cross that tripwire, you're now interfering with a government operation.
Well, it's preventing it, and we have talked about the collusion as well. It would be one thing if it was just the government acting alone, but the speed at which the government and institutional partnership is moving right now, it truly blows me away. And I'll just share my story with Stanford Law School. A few weeks after I announced publicly I was running for vice president with Bobby Kennedy, I get an email from sweet Charlie Munger from Stanford Law School, who has the big conference center dedicated to him because he's such a lovely, wonderful guy. I'd sat in multiple meetings with him. We talked about, how we're going to use the law school to work with all of these innovative new technologies in energy and ecology. Very excited. And I get this mystery email from him saying, I think you should sit out your conference this year. This is a conference that I helped design, I built from nothing, called Future Law. And it has sold out the last many years. It's a legal AI conference that is now like the gold standard. And I have the same role every year where I go in and I help host a segment called the Lex Talks. But just very casually out of nowhere, you should just sit this one out. And I said, no, I'm not sitting out my conference. That's silly, Mr. Munger. I will be there. And he's like, well, no, you can't. And then he offers me a few alternatives. He says, well, we'll take you off the agenda. You are not to tell any members of the press you are to be here. We don't want anything political. And keep in mind, this is Stanford University, who has Obama, Condoleezza Rice regularly on campus. So the speed at which that message gets down into actionable form, it makes me wonder if this preemptive cognitive vaccine has already been at play. Because how else would you move that quickly?
Yeah, well, I'm fascinated at that interplay between the government and institutional favors for favors relationship. We were talking earlier about this bizarre set of twin programs at the National Science Foundation. One of them is called the Convergence Accelerated Track F program. The other one is called the Secure and Trustworthy Cyberspace program. And in the charter documents for these programs, which distribute $100 million to this web of universities, Stanford, for example, got a joint.
Yeah, Stanford's
$3 million,
like the heartland.
Yeah, they got a joint
Yeah.
$3 million grant for just for scanning and banning online misinformation, which was in the public health space and in the political speech space. But in the documents, they structure it in a really cute way, which is to say misinformation is an attack on democracy. It's a threat to democracy. Democracy is defined not as the will of the people and how they vote, but as the consensus of democratic institutions. And so anything that is misinformation, which is basically defined as something that goes against that consensus of democratic
defining it as
institutions.
people,
Yes.
too. So you could say 99% stuff that they're accepting of, but if you hit that 1%, your total being is censored. Your total being and identity is misinformation.
But they'll also tell you that.
Yeah.
And like in my case, you were going to do origin stories. I at some point got the phone call. Your research is correct, but if you don't lay off of that, you will never have a career in academics again. And it's remarkable when the soft indications that you should stop aren't working because the person is convinced, oh, no, it's good. I'm a scientist. I was trained to think critically. I'm allowed to consider all possibilities and all hypotheses. And then when you're told, well, actually, science doesn't work that way at all. And strangely, you're told, and it's just sort of almost in pain listening to this about the National Science Foundation, misinformation, democracy. Am I right that at some level, the people are the greatest threat to democracy? The official misinformation, disinformation, and malinformation is what is being protected because that's what goes around consensus. That subset of the science that supports certain conclusions is labeled the science, and everything else is not. So you have this language problem, which is we've got to protect democracy from the electorate. We've got to protect what we're calling the science from science. We have to protect free speech from people who want to share their opinions. And the language is now so completely crazy that we don't know how to have a discussion. I don't know, I did not know until recently that malinformation was the technical term for information that doesn't go in the direction of the institutional consensus. And I know about debunked, but prebunked, I mean, that was instantaneous because I've been prebunked 18 times because that's what I do. I thought I was getting into a game to do dissenting, responsible, analytic work with these fancy degrees. And the fact is that used to be something you could do. We used to have Serge Lang at Yale, who was one of these great dissenters. We had Noam Chomsky, William F. Buckley from the conservative side. We had all of these great dissenting voices that gave America power through cowboy intellectualism. And now that's gone.
I've seen firsthand the mechanisms, at least within science, how this works, right? So the NIH is responsible for funding a huge amount of biomedical research in the United States and around the world. But it's not even the money that they confer. What they confer is social status, right? So I'm a professor with full tenure at Stanford University in the School of Medicine. One of the main reasons I was able to get that position is because I was successful getting NIH grants, right? It's a social marker. And what they do is they send out, the heads of these institutes, Tony Fauci, will send out requests for proposals with essentially telling you what they want from you. That's the normal way of controlling.
You mean like in conclusions?
Right. I mean, they won't explicitly say what the conclusions were, but the set of ideas that you're allowed to say in order to have any chance of getting funding, and the signal goes out wide and clear, right? So And it's very directed. And it didn't, I don't think it always used to be like this, but like the very top of the institution says, here's the kind of science we want you to do. Here's the kind of inquiries we want. And that essentially constrains the set of things that scientists are allowed to ask. Because I don't want to not get tenure. I mean, I don't want to be on the outside.
Yeah, the qualified queries.
Yeah.
Maybe if we tease that out to see if it dovetails with what Mike's saying. Am I reading you correctly that the NIH might put out a proposal saying current misinformation about public health threatens the lives of Americans? A request for proposal, we want to study how disinformation propagates online that undermines confidence in our medical institutions.
I'm 99%
And the
sure.
argument is subsumed in the request. It's saying, how should we do this, as opposed to maybe there's actually a lot of dissent and we should be talking about why have many experts lost confidence in these products, in these protocols.
Eric, that's exactly what happens. And it has real consequences for the health of the American people.
Yeah.
Right? The American people have invested millions and millions, tens of hundreds of millions of dollars, for instance, on prevention of Alzheimer's disease. And for decades, the NIH only permitted hypotheses were from a very narrow range of thinking.
Amyloid plaque.
Amyloid
Plaque,
plaque. And it turns out very likely that it's not the most it's not, at least not the proximate cause of Alzheimer's disease. That we needed other kinds of thinking.
Well,
to
the
allow.
establishing paper, it turns out, was fraudulent.
But for a decade or more, if you were in this field, you could not get an NIH grant unless you took that as the main hypothesis you took. You did
Well,
not,
but
right?
then
So
next you're going to be questioning the food pyramid or what causes ulcers.
Or saturated fat.
Nerd humor.
I mean, but that's the problem, right? So science needs to have people. You can't put a scarlet F for fringe on every single scientist that has a different idea. Mm-hmm. It makes no sense. It just kills science and it hurts the health of the American people.
Yeah, we're in a tough situation. So maybe this is a good time to talk about remedies, because I think each one of us have been really focused on what are the tools available to us to reseat our standing. I personally, represent a lot of these moms who have intuition about the chronic health issue in the United States. And moms have been under such incredible, and dads too. It's usually the mom that smells it first, but the parents, let's talk about well-meaning parents looking for remedies. I know that parents out there are very, very desperate to figure out how to break free of the suffocating environment in which they can't access real science, or if they find a scientist who has written a paper that says, this is what happened to my kid, but that scientist has been, quote, debunked. They're left with nothing. They're left with more of these unexplained illnesses. Oftentimes you'll hear unexplained infertility, unexplained GI issues, unexplained neurological disorder. Everything is now going unexplained. And anytime you try to explain it, you're criticized. I mean, this is absolutely wild. So let's talk about all the remedies that you have found successful or pending success. You've had a huge one, Jay. Supreme Court case. You're a plaintiff. You are bringing a First Amendment issue. So First Amendment is one that we're all looking at very closely. Constitutional right that seems to be not taken very seriously today. But is this a path forward for us?
I think that the two major principles are we need to decentralize the power of the institution so that it allows other voices that are that now are on the outside in, voices that have some expertise, but for whatever reason it's expertise that's challenging the center of power. And then we need radical transparency. Right, and so free speech is a piece of that, of a part of, fundamental part of that, right? So what happened to me was that the government decided that what I was saying was so wrong or dangerous or whatever, inconvenient, that it sent messages to social media companies saying, if you have people saying the kinds of things Jay says, label them, throw them off, make them into fringe figures. Don't let them have a voice. And don't tell them, by the way, that they've been ghosted. So they'll think that they're seeing things when they're not. The idea that the government can tell social media companies who and what to censor, that was the heart of that case. And unfortunately, Nicole, we had some really good rulings in the lower courts and in the Supreme Court. The Supreme Court ruled, it was a very interesting ruling. It said that I lacked standing to sue for this case, which meant that because I couldn't show an email directly from the government to the social media company saying censor J, therefore it was okay that they went from the social media, the government told social media companies censor the kinds of ideas J says. So you're running mate Bobby Kennedy, he also has a case, a very similar case, and he certainly has that. He meets that standard for standing, right? He
was just granted an injunction
in that case, which is fantastic news.
Wonderful.
But what it does is it says the government can't tell social media companies who to censor, but the government can now still, under current law, under the current ruling of the Supreme Court, can tell social media companies what ideas to censor, and no one will have standing because there won't be that email.
When you eliminate a whole person for one idea they might have. What are the other cases? We need remedies. We need case law. We need direction. We need guiding light.
Well, I think for this we need Congress to act. Because the Supreme Court, I've sort of lost a little hope in them.
Well, how do we what party right now do we vote for if we expect Congress to act, or what?
And that case still has a lot of life in it, in the sense that who knows, after full merits discovery, I could see it very easily going back up into the Supreme Court, although it might take 2 years. But for my part, we've been talking about institutions and reseating institutions and the role of trust in that. And I do think that institutions actually sort of naturally reform as trust breaks down, and the reformation of the institutions is part of the trust reinfusion process. But that is being stopped right now because the government has capacity built this coterie of thousands of different outside organizations to artificially preserve what's left of their trust by cancellation tactics and censorship tactics of anyone who amplifies so-called distrust. And so what we were just talking about with the National Science Foundation, with these two programs that they have there, they define democratic institutions as government agencies and the media. The media is actually listed as a democratic institution that misinformation endangers, which means anyone who questions official media narratives is in the crosshairs of $100 million in taxpayer spending to the University of Stanford, to the University of Washington, to the University of Cambridge for these psychological vaccines. And I do think if you were to get rid of the government's gargoyles that defend the artificial remnant of trust, and the state of play would just be how people feel about these institutions, there would be an organic social media wave. There would be an organic response by elected representatives being responsive to seeing that. I've seen this personally dozens of times where change doesn't start in Congress. Congress doesn't take action until it's already on the tip of everyone's tongues, and they know they will be made a hero by sponsoring this bill or by forming this investigation committee, which means the onus is on the people to put it on the tip of everyone's tongues. But that can't be done while you have a North Korea-style mercenary censorship army being capacity built, subsidized by the U.S. federal government to do this. And so I do think if you were to tear down those gargoyle firms, these institutions like NewsGuard and these university centers that we're talking about, and this NGO soft power swarm army, that those institutions would naturally reseat in a much more organic way. So that's what my area of focus.
So I want to get into the remedy stuff, but I think it would be, and this is something I very much appreciated Mike saying on his Tucker Carlson interview. One of the things that you have to do is you have to understand what's motivating this from the perspective. Nobody gets up in the morning saying, how can I be evil and censor good people on the internet? The way this starts is with something like NATO. And the idea is that the people in that permanent class inside of Washington, D.C. and in Brussels say, look, there's certain things that are so important to the functioning of the world that they cannot be endangered when you take a pulse every 4 years of a country like the United States and say, well, where are we at the moment? Because what they call a populist is somebody who has not been pre-vetted by the two vetting organizations. The old model of democracy, from Millard Fillmore into the present, is that there are two parties. Those two parties are supposed to nominate people who are broadly acceptable to the institutions, and then all of us get a binary vote, which is supposed to express our hearts' dreams and hope for the future. That model is in the process of crashing. Now you have 3 candidates who are leading the field, 2 of whom do not appear to be signed up for the institutional consensus at the level that, let's say, the Atlantic Council wants them to be. So their perspective is kind of funny. It's like, look, we're all for democracy as long as it doesn't actually threaten the brittle limb on which the Western world sits. And that means that what you're supposed to be doing is explaining NATO as you see it, explaining NAFTA as you see it, explaining trade rounds as you see them, or the WHO, and then you have to put it in front of the people. And the people may say, yeah, I didn't follow that NAFTA reasoning. I understand the NATO reasoning, but I'm not up for the NAFTA thing, and the WHO seems to be under control that I don't trust. Then you have to go back and say, look, we're losing the people on some of these key institutions. What do we do? That is not happening. And I think that, in large measure, what we have to say, if we want to solve this, is to talk to the thing that doesn't even want to show itself. The thing that doesn't want to show itself is sitting there saying, God, these people go on and on about democracy, and they don't even understand how dangerous the world is. Just let us do our job. We have just seen in the Democratic Party a process that is not explained on Schoolhouse Rock, where a person suffering from dementia, clearly visible to people who have televisions and who can get YouTube, that this person has walked away from the race, leaving us with the vice president that nobody seemed to want, dropped out super early because she couldn't raise money. That's what she said. There was also that Tulsi Gabbard thing that suddenly nobody can remember. And whatever that process is being told to us that democracy is on the ballot. Well, what happens if it's actually democracy and oligarchy that are both on the ballot at the moment? Right?
Great Schoolhouse Rock episode, by the way. But no,
I went back to Schoolhouse Rock, and they say that the two parties choose the candidates. So you have to be very, very careful, because a lot of this sense that we have of democracy is actually post-Democratic Convention in 1968.
I have a feeling Schoolhouse Rock might be canceled after this.
Yeah, that's right. They'll just update the
Yeah,
episode. It'll be selectively added. But it's funny that you mentioned that. So, for example, with NATO, we're talking about public health and the government's role in funding these censorship. So, about a month ago, Dr. Peter Hotez was giving an interview where he called on NATO to intervene online and to censor vaccine skeptics in all the different NATO countries. And a lot of people were saying, "How is this possible? What the heck? Why? You might as well invoke Martians or some alien horde to come in from another galaxy." But the fact is NATO is part of this coterie of rules-based international institutions, democratic institutions that uphold the rules-based international order. But people, part of this change process and this reforming process, and we're talking about like legal solutions, like what Jay is involved in, and I'm talking about sort of like civil society and government reform institutions, and part of reforming from government and getting a coalition within government involves making the public aware of it, so the public talks about it, so the government actors feel motivated to do it. And that involves educating, actually, people about the institutions that they've heard of, but they don't fully understand. And so these are institutions like NATO. A lot of people think that, well, this is the Western world's transatlantic military alliance, but they don't appreciate that institution has gone horribly awry in interfering in domestic civilian politics, which they view as a domain of war, because the opinion of the population impacts their war funding, it impacts all sorts of policies, and they played a very, very nasty role in COVID censorship. NATO Stratcom Center of Excellence, based in Latvia, it was a group set up after the Ukraine coup in 2014 and the counter coup that involved the Crimea annexation. They set up this NATO office to control to censor disinformation in Eastern Europe. That was capacity, but you can understand, you can say, okay, that's a war 7,000 miles away. We have this institution that the American people fund here, and we don't really care what that institution is doing, on the front of that war to influence the hearts and minds of people's news distribution there, or maybe you do, but that institution, that center of excellence, ended up doing a partnership with a company called Graphica, which got $7 million from the U.S. Pentagon. It was a part of the Minerva Initiative, which is our psychological warfare research center of the Pentagon, to do a trans-NATO study as soon as COVID broke out. In January 2020, Graphica and NATO's Stratcom Center of Excellence surveyed all of social media to catalog mis and disinformation about the origin of the virus. They broke down political groups in the US, in the UK, in France.
They're claimed mis and dis.
Right. And malinformation, as you noted, which is even
No,
true.
but I don't want to give them
course.
that's what they were studying, because anybody who thought it might involve the Wuhan Institute of Virology was sort of engaging in what was being claimed to be mis or dis.
Totally.
Yeah.
But there's so many unanswered questions about the role of the Pentagon, which administrated the COVID epidemic, which subsidizes, as Jay was discussing, the gain of function research, because you are super juicing viruses in order to create a vaccine on it, but that's a military dominion. But you had the military doing the censorship response of anyone who questioned whether the military may have been responsible for the virus. But we're supposed to have a civilian-run government. We're supposed to have a civilian-run media. So who answers to who here? But that is, I think, that sort of education is what elevates people on social media, people who do public speaking. This is a process that happened with the New Left in the 1960s and 70s. This is how we got reform from the Church Committee. We have a Senate Intelligence Committee now only because it took this intelligence agencies operating domestically, infiltrating left-wing student movement groups who were opposed to Vietnam, and it took this whole collective consciousness raising. It took 15 years for a coalition to form around the Noam Chomsky types. That ended up making its way into Congress, and that's what ended up establishing a whole new structure of oversight. Now that we now need new oversight, but that is the process we're in this stage now.
Required a 1971 break-in in Media, Pennsylvania, to the FBI office, I think during a Super Bowl,
COINTELPRO.
to get COINTELPRO as a word that nobody knew what it meant. And then it was under FOIA that we had to pry open the information about our own government, because our own government has a very strong sense of state secrets. And I think that we have to be, like, for example, I think the average American doesn't know that they know about spousal privilege and they know about attorney-client privilege and physician-patient privilege. Do they know about state secret privilege, which came from the UK? They probably don't. There's an entire parallel architecture in the intelligence community and then in the NatSec world, which the average American doesn't know. And so part of the problem that we're having here is that we're having a one-sided conversation where one group says we are so important that we can't talk about things in an open society, and that by allowing that idea to progress unchecked, you said originally this is like almost, somebody said it's almost like an intelligence operation. This is an intelligence operation against our own people. We had the Smith-Mundt Act that was supposed to keep us from being propagandized.
We
have social,
very specifically, no domestic dissemination.
of like VOA stuff.
Yep.
And right now what you have is you have spy companies that are called things like search companies or social media companies that have dossiers on us, that have back doors, and the back of house of these companies is not shared with us. We don't know that we're the subject of an intelligence operation because we don't think of ourselves. I'm not a spy. I'm not trying to sell, arms to Belarusia or something like that. How is it that I am in your crosshairs? How have I wandered into your crosshairs because I know some statistics or I know something about genetics? It doesn't really make sense. And I think that the way that you get there is you start from this perspective of we need a secret architecture, which I believe that we do need. But if you believe in a secret architecture, you also have to believe in civilian oversight. And if none of us are permissioned, to look into your dark corners and dark places. If effectively you can't let us in because it's too dangerous, then you've developed a second government. It is a shadow government at that point. Now, I don't know whether we have a shadow government, but I definitely know that the world's smartest people in the areas that I care about have essentially zero comprehension what the national security people are doing in the areas that are relevant.
Well, and again, like, we're associated with some of the biggest organizations on the planet, and if we don't know through our massive networks who's running the show, I mean, that means it must be a pretty small group of very, very influential folks who are all hiding behind something. And I think we all have a sense of who these people are. And I don't think our goal is to, go out and put them on trial necessarily.
Get them to talk.
We want to identify who they are. We want transparency. We like accountability. But most importantly, I think we'd like to restructure consensus building so that there is qualified governance. There's governance that represents the people. There's disclosures. We know how to go on.
Sorry, Nicole. Can I give an example of this? Because what you said is so important. That it's the people's interests need to be represented in these decisions, right? So let me take a very concrete example, right? It's very likely that this pandemic was caused by a kind of research that essentially turned viruses they went out into the wild places, got viruses that would never have seen the light of day, brought them into labs. And the civilian excuse was, well, we need to study these viruses to see if they might make the leap and then develop countermeasures, vaccines before they make the leap, right? And so they're doing these dangerous experiments, and a very small number of people signed off on them. Tony Fauci signed off on these experiments. In 2012, he wrote a paper where he explicitly wrote that even if these experiments result in a worldwide pandemic, it'll be worth it because of the knowledge gained, right? Well, who is he to make that decision of such a risky activity that impacts every single person on the face of the earth by himself or with a small group of people? The expertise that would have represented those people needed to be at the table when those decisions were made.
Yeah.
And it shouldn't have just been that small group of people making a decision that very likely caused the pandemic. This kind of like true democratization, the representation of the people via expertise, dissenting expertise, I think that's the path forward.
If you think about what Jay is saying, the idea behind what was being done at the EcoHealth Alliance in its partnership with the Wuhan Institute of Virology was this theory that to this day nobody's discussing called One Health. And One Health was this idea that you can't work on human health alone. We're all part of this Gaia ecosystem. It's very hippy-dippy. And what does it mean? It means you have to go out into all of the world's most dangerous virus reservoirs and bring this stuff back to labs in populated places and work on them and see whether you can humanize these things.
It's funny because that phrase was coined by this group that actually I thought had actually good intentions in mind. It does make sense to understand how animals interact with humans. Up to a point. But it was essentially grabbed
That's it.
by people who just essentially used it to put this nice aura of let's understand how the world works into this very, very dangerous set of experiments that very likely cause the harm to the health and well-being of every single person on the face of the earth.
But Jay, do we even know, in a certain sense, whether this was a workaround to get around the Biological Weapons Convention of the 1970s and the Geneva Convention? In other words, my concern about this is we're talking about a phenomenon that I call Jessupization. If you think about the interchange between Colonel Jessup and Lieutenant Caffrey in A Few Good Men, it's not the way we remember it. These are two perspectives, the NatSec perspective and the democracy perspective. And Jack Nicholson has a much stronger point until he occasionally veers into this thing where he says, I provide the freedom, right? Which is Moses' sin, that he points to himself rather than realizing that he's part of a greater structure. And I believe that in some sense what we're seeing is a group of people who are saying, that deep down at a place that we don't like to talk about at parties, we're glad that they're there. And I'm actually not sure, and I'd like to get to the part of you're under arrest, you son of a bitch. And it's not necessarily just, I don't want to punish anybody. I want this stuff to appear in a forum where I can trust that if I can't see the data because it's too dangerous, let's say the weaponization of anthrax or something like that, I want to know that somebody who holds my general concerns, who's highly competent, feels that they 100% were part of it, the consensus building before we got to how do we push it out, and that those people are representing the interests where I cannot. Like, I'm not a virologist, I'm not an epidemiologist. I need to have an expert. And the great danger about this is that if you don't want to play with the dissenting experts, just wait a decade and you're going to be taking this from internet figures who were, until recently, gamers who were streaming on Twitch.
These labs, Wuhan is not unique, unfortunately. There's several of them, and it's possible some of this work is being done here in the United States, too, as well.
There certainly is.
Yeah.
That's a 100% certainty. Like the U.S. NIH publicly funded American labs to do some of this work.
When did Plum Island shut down, or is it still going? I don't even know.
I think it's now shut down. But I think it's 2011. There was a H1N1 virus that was essentially weaponized in the Netherlands, and funded by U.S. taxpayers.
The Rocky Mountain Lab too in Montana. It has a lot of.
Well, the work being done at these places may or may not be worthwhile, may or may not be scientifically interesting, and so on. But I think we should have at the table representatives of the people to say, look, you scientists think that this is worth the risk to the entire world. Well, I don't think that's true. Like, maybe we shouldn't invest in you, right? Instead, what we have is the scientists themselves regulating whether those risks get taken.
Some scientists.
Yes, a very few scientists themselves who stand to gain in the ladder of scientific respectability or whatever from doing this work, taking risks that may impact the health of every single human being.
Can I make one note on this? Because I always refer to the field of disinformation studies as being censorship gain of function, because it's basically the same sort of mad science that could destroy the world, on the sort of free speech and democratic society side that could literally physically destroy the world on the sort of virus side, where what they do is they're juicing up censorship techniques. And they do this in this sort of One Health style way. And this is what the Convergence Accelerator Track F program is at the National Science Foundation, which is for trust, in online news. And so it's a convergence accelerator. It converges all these different disciplines who don't normally talk together and interact. The linguistics people, the psychology people, the sociology people, the computational data science people, so that they're all working together to build this psychological vaccine. And so they're sort of taking that approach, but then the whole field itself is also cloistered in the same sort of intelligence, national security cloak that gain of function work is. These people always have someone from the CIA, someone from the military, on their side. Now, oftentimes it won't be CIA operations, it'll be a CIA analyst. The CIA on the analyst side will often recruit professors who are specialists in a particular language or region or cultural group when they are doing an operation in that, or they'll have basically bookworm types, and they'll then, when they leave the CIA, they now have a new track career to be an academic at the University of Stanford or MIT or Cambridge. Mm-hmm. And then they themselves will have partnerships with DARPA. They themselves will have partnerships with NATO. And they will effectively have a little bit of a public-facing light. Like, you might read in the New York Times that there was funding to this gain of function thing, but you're not going to be able to really look behind the hood. You may read on the National Science Foundation grant page that this university got a disinformation grant to study, anti-NATO narratives circulating in NATO countries. But there's this whole cloistered national security underworld iceberg that they effectively, do that Jack Nicholson thing where it's listen, the NATO, because one of the funniest moments in my journey in learning all of this was, there was this German Marshall Fund meeting, and it was like 2019, and I think it was General John Allen, who was, I think, the Supreme Allied Commander of NATO, or he ran the Afghanistan forces, and he had just become the head of Brookings Institution, one of the largest think tanks. And he was asked to give, he gave a talk at one of the panels of the top 3 geopolitical threats to the world order, and the third one was online hate speech. It was not like Russian aggression. And what he said is, you have this situation where hate speech gives rise to ethnocentrism, which gives rise to nationalism, which gives rise to opposition to the rules-based international world order. This is what gave rise to Brexit. It'll give rise to Frexit and it'll exit and Spexit and Grexit. And so then the EU will come undone, and then that means NATO will come undone. That means the IMF and the World Bank will come undone. So the whole rules-based international order will collapse if we allow the civilian class. Again, this is a 4-star general. If we allow the civilian class to speak freely online.
I'm so glad we're doing this. So a different version of this is in my work in economics with my wife, Pia Milani, we solved a problem called the changing preference problem, that you couldn't allow people's tastes to change over time or all the models stopped functioning. And unfortunately, we found out that there was a structural paper written by Gary Becker and George Stigler, 2 Nobel laureates in economics, that states, and it baldly, we believe that you don't argue over tastes because tastes are the same to all men and don't change over time. Now, this is the dumbest thing I've ever seen in an academic journal, but they go in great detail as to how this works. And I'm sitting there fighting this, saying, we have a mathematical solution to this problem, but this paper solves it by fiat, by just positing something that we know isn't true, that humans never change their tastes and we all have the same taste. And I get this email saying, I can't stand to watch you fighting this. You have to understand that when we set up the University of Chicago Economics Department, the reason it's so powerful and so famous is in part that it was a bulwark against totalitarian communism funded from inside the intelligence world.
Yep.
And then the person says to me, so I say, I don't understand. How can anybody believe that all tastes are constant? And what comes back is we forgot to tell our descendants that this was being set up as a bulwark against totalitarian communism, so that when the end of the Cold War came, the grandchildren intellectually of this period have no idea that they're actually carrying out a long dead intelligence program so that the field can't progress. And I was just flabbergasted by this.
That's wild.
So funny because the Chicago School of Economics was used as the justification for the military takeover and international redevelopment of countries in Latin America. And this is part of fighting Marxist liberation theology, was this idea that we're bringing market capitalism to them. And so the Chicago School of Economics.
This was a piece of kryptonite. In other words, the changing preference problem gave anyone the opportunity to say, I appreciate all this work on neoclassical economics that you've pushed out to the planet, but are you telling me the whole thing collapses if we have tastes that change over time? So in other words, they shoved in a fix with paper clips and masking tape. And then, and 50 years later, I think it was a 1977 paper called De Gustibus Non Est Disputandum, we're still living in a world in which you can't innovate in economics mathematically because we're still fighting the Cold War.
That undermines also so many principles of how we think about capitalism and democracy and these very basic structures around democracy.
Oh my God, did you see?
That undermines a lot if you accept that it is too basic of a structure that doesn't actually match to reality.
So did you see your neighbor Mark Andreessen and Ben Horowitz's podcast where they talked about going to the White House and the issue of AI? And they said, these visitors say, well, you can't ban math. And the White House says, oh, yes, we can. We had to do it for theoretical physics. In theoretical physics, you've got something called restricted data, which sounds completely innocuous, which means that it's the only category of intellectual property that is born secret. That means that if you're working at a cafe, you have no job with the federal government, you're not under any restrictions. If you write down something that can potentially impinge upon nuclear weaponry, it is already Q classified just at the table. No government agency has to come in. Then we have another concept called a deemed export, which is intellectual like ideas that you can't share with foreign nationals. You don't understand how much NatSec infrastructure lives inside of these places. And Jay, one of the most meaningful things you ever said to me was something like, I've been at Stanford for 30 plus years, and I had no idea how the place even worked.
Yeah, I mean, for me, I wandered into this in 2020, right? I was a professor of 2 decades at Stanford. I've been at Stanford now almost 40 years as a student and as a professor. The world I thought I inhabited was a world that there are ideas that people fight over with the kinds of weapons that I say what I believe, you say what you believe. Mike comes up with data and you turn out to be right, and then I take you to dinner and say, okay, next time, right? That's the world I thought we fought in. Like that's what I inhabited. The world that I've seen since 2020 is just it's so unlike that world, because it's, instead of that spirit of dissent and open-mindedness, reliance on data, real logic, a desire to make sure that people regular people's lives are not harmed by what we do. Instead, what we have is this world of power and control, where people tell themselves stories that if they let people have their say, if they let dissent in, that all hell will break loose. But in fact, all hell has broken loose.
Yeah, all hell has broken loose. And I think there's a misconception amongst this group that dissent is an attack on their character or an attack on their credibility. That's how they behave when you dissent. And that's problematic, because where did the foundations of debate actually go, and how did they devolve so quickly into an assumption of a character assassination? I mean, it is one-sided. It's largely because they've undertook that culture, but we haven't undertaken that culture by any measure. And I think that's a culture that we're very much hoping to preserve.
Well, and it's also the case that how did the U.S. as a young country end up with the lion's share of the world's great research institutions? Mm-hmm. And the short answer is dissent. Is that cowboy culture, yeehaw, is all about challenging each other and going out for a drink afterwards. And when this came in, and I'm old, so I really saw this coming in the 80s and 90s, and it got to other things like public health at this level much later, because we've been blessed not to have serious pandemics, so it wasn't tested. But if you were trying to do immigration work in the late 80s and early 90s, this is industrial strength, personal destruction of reputation. It basically destroys your ability to earn a living as a credentialed expert. And it's been there for a long time, but it hasn't gotten to each of us personally at the same moment. And it's gotten much, much worse in the last, the last 10 years. I think since the Dear Colleague memo of Ruslan Ali in the Obama administration. That's when the universities really start to go crazy, and then their products start emerging into, let's say, the New York Times or the Atlantic, or some of these new organizations for policing the internet, and that the products of that have been absolutely terrifying.
And it coincided with other things that happened to the Smith-Mundt Act. That was the changing of the domestic dissemination ban. They lifted it. They said now the US AGM, which is a massive media agency owned by the government, which used to disseminate this information just overseas, could now be allowed to disseminate to the American public effectively US propaganda. There's still a restriction on targeting individuals, but we've found Weston Sager, a young independent attorney, filed a FOIA request and found that they had, in fact, used social media to target. So there's many of these underpinnings that are required. They're prerequisites for the slippage that has amounted to where we are in 2024 today. You talk about it a lot, Mike, and you know, I think that there's plenty of evidence. But I want to make sure we get back to solutions, because we're a little bit on our back foot, all of us, right now, and we're fighting from our back foot. We've got to figure out how to get on our front foot. What are congressional legislation, you know, vote for individuals that are talking about free speech? It's just really simple. These are constitutional defenders. If anyone is anti-free speech or has spoken about misinformation, they're likely bought into this regime. So that's one solution, but we've got to get on our front foot somehow, and I think we've got to get on our front foot quickly. So, you know, we're not disclosing like our master plan by any measure, but, you know, what are some of the things that we should be thinking about to get on our front foot? Obviously, X has been a blessing to many of us. Being re-platformed has been a blessing to many of us. We still have hope in our institutions. Jay, you have a conference on the Great Barrington Declaration at Stanford, which I think is wonderful. Kudos to Stanford.
Congratulations.
For doing that. Anything else we should be?
Yeah. Okay. So I've to tell you, like I've gone from despondent to like hopeful in many ways, and I think part of it is like I was at one point in my life, and even in 2020, I was convinced that we didn't need politics to solve this. We could just do this if we just had good people talking to each other, and I think actually there does actually need to be a political movement around this, right? It's because it's people's interests that are not represented. That's why I'm so glad to see you and Bobby running, because you're injecting into the conversation things that the American people need to talk about and think about. It's absolutely vital, and I think that really political angle actually is. I don't mean vote for person A or person B. I mean the political angle of telling the people, here's what's happening. What do you really want? What do you want from these institutions? These institutions, they have their legitimacy based on the people. Mike, you were talking about this earlier. I thought that was really powerful. If they're not representing the people, then what are they for? Who are they representing?
Well, they're representing the corporations who have now multiple interests. Mike, you just posted the other day, and I didn't even know the extent of this, but that Google is a major investor in vaccines.
Yeah.
So they're both censoring dissenting opinions while cashing out.
Financially invested. That's a great job if you can get it. You know, to be in control. You've invested in a product and you can control how everyone thinks about the product. I mean, that's a dream. But you know, you see this now with entities like NewsGuard too, who will work with certain companies, and then it just so happens the things that they censor happen to be anything that opposes that particular, company or ad agency who's got these portfolio companies who are benefiting from the rigged searches or the suppression of anyone who criticizes this. I mean, but I do think that there is this issue with, Eric mentioned this term, credentialed expert, and talking about the science and the financial economy of doing science work is so much about grants. Most secondary research, the National Science Foundation is the single largest funder of grants in secondary education. I mean, it's not really even a private university research ecosystem. The government grants dwarf it. And I almost think of it like the McKinsey analogy, where companies will want to fire lay people off, but they don't want to get sued over doing it. So what they need is an outside validator, an independent consulting company like McKinsey. And they will hire McKinsey not to get, a dispassionate third-party opinion about whether or not they should go through with the restructuring, but they give the wink, wink, nudge, nudge / informal, golf course conversation with their liaison at McKinsey. We need this report to say that we need to fire these people because we're going to hold that up so that we don't get hit with loss. That'll make it go down easier. And that is the role of this sort of mercenary science in a lot of places. And I think it's hard to change that simply on the basis of ideology, because you have the financial interests, right? Like, people do not want to lose their livelihoods. Well, where else am I going to get the money from if I decline to do this research and now I'm a pariah in Tony Fauci's eyes or whatnot? And I think this gets to this kind of whole society framework that I think is necessary on this, which is, and again, I'm also hopeful like Jay is. even you look at the Murphy, Missouri decision where Jay is a plaintiff. We had these great lower court rulings. Supreme Court made in my view a disastrous blunder. But the very next day, in I think it was Washington Post, but it may have been another sort of comparable. No less than Nina Jankowicz, the disinformation czar, the head of the Disinformation Governance Board, who sued Fox News for defamation for calling her a censor, and then the court just last week said, actually, we're dismissing the lawsuit because you were a censor. But she wrote an article the very next day or 2 days after the decision saying that she was not optimistic about the ruling. And I think the title of it was something like, the Murphy SCOTUS decision cannot undo the damage wrought against disinformation studies. And I think that's true. But that is because everyone activated from all the different areas. You had multiple different congressional committees, from judiciary to House. You had state attorney generals taking action. You had private sector lawyers taking action. You had media and tons of media on it. And you had civil society watchdog organizations and nonprofits. So you had this sort of whole society freedom alliance, which everybody sort of was able to do their part. That is how they actually established the censorship apparatus, was through a whole of society. So I think that whole of society eye view is the way to look at solutions on it, and it's already racked up a lot of victories.
There's a practical thing that every person listening to this can do. Every single person, you can ask your congressional candidates, where do you stand on free speech? Where do you stand on the censorship complex? Where do you stand on regulation of science? Where do you stand on corporate ownership of these kinds of these decisions about health? Like, what is your position? Why are you not taking a position? Like, every single person, Democrat, Republican, it doesn't matter, should be asked these questions before they accept power.
And then reform of the journals possibly as well, because the censorship is happening at the institutional scientific journal level. You talk a lot about this, and it's we are due for a new model of publishing and reviewing scientific literature.
One of the strangest things is that you can talk to 100 randomly chosen professors at the top research universities in the country, and none of them know the history of peer review. So you have the very interesting situation that the people who are responsible for peer review do not know where it came from, do not know what happened in 1972 in medicine and what happened in 1975 to stop something called the Bauman Amendment. One of the things that we find is that people are living in a world that they have no idea how it actually works. So I got into a very public fight.
I think people are starting to get an idea.
Well,
that's the good news.
Okay, but in terms of what you're saying, solutions, one of the things that I think that you, Nicole, can do, given your multiple hats, right? So you're wearing a science philanthropy hat, a law hat, and a candidate hat. I think that the idea that we were talking about earlier about releasing the glossary of terms that, like, Mike has uncovered, when he says rules-based international order, people have no idea that that's like a set phrase and that you have to really understand what it actually means.
We will be releasing a glossary of terms after this.
Brilliant. Yeah. Hearings, the Church and Pike hearings. I think Gary Hart is still alive, who was on the Church committee. People have to, why don't we reach out to Gary Hart and say, well, what actually happened when we had to look at what the intelligence community was? We found out there was something called Section A of the Reserve Index, which was people to be rounded up in times of national emergency. And who are these people? Are they criminals? Are they gang leaders? No, they're the independently wealthy, TV newscasters, labor leaders, professors, anyone who could sway hearts and minds. We don't even know that there's a secret history of the McCarran Act, which sought to take the success, as it was understood by the NatSec complex, of the Japanese incarceration and set up prospective camps for communists that then they were disallowed when Daniel Inouye led a fight against this because he was in a position to do so. That reoccurs under FEMA. You have this entire history of the United States. Think about Howard Zinn on lots and lots of steroids. There is a NatSec history of the United States that to know about it means that you're a crazy person. And I think that this, right?
More like Howard Zinn on hallucinogenics.
On hallucinogenics. And the interesting thing is that most people don't know what the CIA does. They think Central Intelligence Agency, but it's also the covert operation. Some people say, oh, covert, that just means silent or quiet. No, it means deniable. It means we have a plan for gaslighting you if you trip over this, which is called deconfliction. So one of the things we can do is we can get all of the terminology. Like, how many Americans understand that there are 3 separate deconfliction systems to prevent blue on blue, two teams of good guys running into each other? You've got an undercover guy pretending to be a Mexican drug lord, and he's going to be busted by local police, and they have a system for figuring this out. We don't understand our own lives, our own government, until we understand the national security complex. But to take an interest in the national security complex is to court this term conspiracy theorist, which is a fascinating term. We all know that conspiracies exist. We have RICO acts, after all. But to posit a conspiracy in front of the government or in front of one of the political parties before they get to it, if you're reading ahead in the script, that's one of the worst crimes you can commit.
Well, it hasn't turned out great for people who have taken that course.
Well, what I would say is, and this is the bitter pill for us. I know it's supposed to be light and fun, but there's one thing that I think we really have to look at. National security is a really strange thing to be tasked with. You actually do have to do some dirty stuff. You have to do some stuff that's quiet. And you've got to do some stuff that's in the national interest that you can't bring to a vote. What we need to do is we need to talk to these people and say, listen, we understand what you're saying about NATO. We understand what you're saying about public health. We understand the game theory of it all. Right now, what you're doing is going to destroy everything you've built. If we just took our hands off and went to the beach, you would destroy it in short order. Is there anything that you want to tell us? Instead of going after us, would you prefer to work with us because we have the credibility, because we stood up? I will stand up again if the NatSec complex decides to go after ordinary human beings and torch them. Like, we didn't talk about human terrain and the subject of cultural anthropology. They've weaponized fields like cultural anthropology so that you can do a study of how people think and treat it as if it's terrain. If we don't know the terminology, if we don't know the history, then we are effectively just clueless rubes who've gotten off the bus in a very dangerous part of town, and we have no idea where we are. We have to arm ourselves with the information, the terminology, and the history.
Yeah. One of the individuals that I think inspire this conversation, I wasn't actually previously aware of her until you shared prior to us going live, is Frances Kelsey, who was the scientist that prevented thalidomide from coming to the United States, which was prescribed to pregnant women to help offset morning sickness. Later, Frances alone rang the alarm bells that this was responsible for horrible birth defects. She came to the United States, worked very, very hard to prevent it from coming into the United States, thus saving many, many children here from the fate that hundreds of thousands of children suffered in Europe.
Yeah, so actually, it was Eric that brought this up, but it's such a really important story.
Because your story sort of echoes this, and we need to get these inspiring stories out, because you're not a crazy mom if what you're trying to do is to say, I will stand up to absolutely anything that comes after my child.
Can I say one point about her? She's an absolute hero to me, right? So she worked for the FDA, and she wasn't like the top of it, but she was just an honest scientist inside the FDA bureaucracy, and she looked at the data and said, look, there's not enough information here to guarantee the safety of this drug. Show me more. And in the meantime, the equivalent in Europe had already signed off on it. And all these moms took this drug with the assurance it was safe based on what their version of the FDA was telling them. And it wasn't safe. It led to their babies, many of their babies being born with no limbs. It was just absolutely heartbreaking, and so for her to stand up as a scientist in favor of the truth, and then to have the institution so that it would listen to this dissenting voice, that protected all these moms and dads and babies in the United States. When in Europe they'd failed, they let thalidomide into the public with a promise that would stop you from getting morning sickness, but it just makes your baby have no limbs or have this major birth defects. That's a model for how our institutions need to be. It's not that we don't need institutions. We need people inside the institutions that speak for the people.
And think about how many of the people who have these characteristics passed through the University of Chicago. So one thing in terms of positive things to do is to hold a conference at the University of Chicago, which I think has gotten somewhat beaten up during this time, but it's gotten a lot less beaten up than everywhere else. Mm-hmm. And we need to realize that we have to repopulate from the places that did their best job of standing up. I believe that if you go to the University of Chicago, you learn very quickly. It's in your blood, it's in the ethos, it's in the DNA. This is a place of scholarship.
My favorite economist came from there.
Who was that?
Ronald Coase, of course.
This is one of the great stories of all time. Yeah. And you know, in understanding which of our institutions have fared better, we have to recognize that, you know, okay, I'm sure there are times when it's been Princeton or Stanford or Berkeley, but right now I think we need to look to the University of Chicago and ask, what did these tiny numbers of individuals do? When you believe individuals like Dean Boyer or President, who is it, Bob Zimmer, you know, these are pivotal individuals. And just picking up on Francis Olhem Kelsey, we need to get back to the point where one person standing up is sufficient to turn back a tide of tens of thousands.
And that was one of the most beautiful thoughts, was that we are part of a tradition and we don't even know it. That this is not actually new. It's just ongoing. It crops up throughout history, and there's an opportunity to recognize that we walk in the steps of those individuals like Francis Kelsey. And, you know, JFK, when he was president, acknowledged Francis and gave her a Medal of Honor, I believe, correct?
Absolutely. Beautiful, beautiful moment.
It was a beautiful moment.
Can you imagine a government and, you know, the uncle of your running mate being able to say that the woman who stood up to pharmaceuticals is the one who should be getting our praise? And that tradition of courage is something we need to reinfuse.
And it gave us trust in the FDA.
Well, and there was a law passed in 1962 actually giving the FDA power to regulate the efficacy of drugs, right? And it revamped the FDA. It was a major accomplishment of the Kennedy administration. And I think, you know, the kinds of institutions that have at their heart the good of the people, that have the people represented, automatically will have these kinds of dissenting ideas allowed, permitted, even sometimes honored as part of them. It will never have the structures you're talking about, Mike, where like the goal is to silence, the goal is to suppress, the goal is to like hammer down and label with the scarlet letter anyone that disagrees. That's so fundamentally un-American. I think to me then the solution is let's empower the people to speak up again and ask for those institutions back.
And that will require a renegotiation of the balance of power between civilians and the national security state, the secrecy state, you know, the under iceberg of it. You know, I sometimes use the analogy that the national security state, if you go back to the biblical story of Adam and Eve, you know, Adam eats the apple and gets cast out of Eden. And you can almost think of that like cancellation for eating the apple. But you know what's interesting about that is, you know, that apple is from the fruit of the tree of knowledge, and not just the fruit of the tree of knowledge, but it's the fruit of the tree of knowledge of good and evil.
Yeah.
So you have this structure which has grown and subsumed all these different things. Jay, you didn't want anything to do with the Pentagon, I bet. I bet you didn't, like, it's the farthest thing from your practice, but yet you saw it descend over your field.
Yeah.
You know, people have we're spending $300 billion in Ukraine. It'll probably go up to $1 trillion, you know, in a couple years. And this is something we all have opinions, but we're finding our opinions are being censored by a military class when we're supposed to have a civilian. But you have this class where, because it's a secret, it's it's a classified apple. If you eat it and you learn this knowledge, you are cast out of Eden, and you join us in the Council of the Canceled.
It's scary at first, but there's a lot of us out here, and it actually is really grounding.
Right, but
Very nice.
They've set themselves up as the God figure in that anecdote, and that's not the way it was supposed to be. In a civilian-run government, the civilians, are the spirit, the Holy Spirit of it, if you will. It is, the military, the national security state, the intelligence agencies, and all of their proxies in the NGO world and the university world are supposed to be answerable to the civilians. And I think one thing that's actionable in all of this is we understand that there's military work and national security and intelligence work, for things in foreign countries and, where the troops are moving, secret military bases, whatnot. But the fact is so much of it, and Eric, hit on this phrase, is hearts and minds work. And the issue is that hearts and minds work is effectively classified, and we become casualties of a proxy war playing out above our heads, because with the end of the Smith-Mundt Act, now hearts and minds work that's done by the U.S. State Department's Global Engagement Center can now come back, because that Global Engagement Center now is a partnership with the University of Cambridge for their psychological vaccine to stop fake news, which is designed to prevent...
And the Five Eyes agreement, where the idea is we can't spy on our own people, so we agree to spy on the people of other Anglophone countries. It's like, how many of us are aware of these sort of bizarre arrangements, and we can't talk about them? You want to...
I have a proposal, because we're at time, that we reconvene in Chicago at some point in the near future.
Done.
Sound good?
Absolutely.
It's great.
And we'll invite more. I know there's several on this live stream that ought to be a part of this conversation. And let's get back to it soon. And I really think, I feel like we could keep going for hours and hours and hours. I'm sure we'll continue.
We are after, actually.
I know, we will after we go off the live stream. But thank you, everybody, for joining us to the very, very first Council of the Canceled. I hope it was helpful. Leave your questions in the comments. And
suggestions.
And suggestions in the comments. I do love all the suggestions I've been getting on X, and many of them have actually led to this convening. So keep it up. Thank you so much, Jay, Eric, Mike. It's been a real pleasure.
Well, thanks for making this happen. Wow.
Wow, thank you. Take care. Bye, guys.